Thank you very much for inviting us to give our presentation at this wonderful workshop, and also thanks to the organizers for inviting our paper to the Frontiers issue. I'm going to talk about herding, and of course you may ask, why am I talking about herding? Because we have now increasingly smart digital technologies, so the presence of humans all the time along with the animals might not be needed. We can remotely sense vegetation and see where the grass is greener and where much more biomass grows. And we can virtually fence the animals to keep them in the spots we want them to graze. We can follow their tracks by satellite transmitted GPS data and see whether they go to the regions we would like them to graze. And we can use activity sensors that inform us about aggressivity or probably also inactivity, which can then signal problems in the herd. So why herding? Well, we know, as we can see on this image, that the grass is not always forage, and our remotely sensed vegetation may not be able to clearly tell us where animals should graze. We need to also know the species, their palatability, their nutrient content, and that can mostly be researched on the ground and not from above. To adjust the grazing to the square meter level also, virtual fencing may not be really suitable. And in addition, the technology is quite expensive and, for example, not yet allowed in Germany, where I am placed. And if we get signals from our GPS collars or from our pedometers that there is something wrong with our herd, how do we interfere if we are 100 kilometers away? So we postulate that the services, and especially the ecosystem services provided by herding, do exceed the services that are provided by unattended grazing. In the first place, of course, herding improves animal nutrition. What you see here is a village map from Niger, from a village in which cattle are grazing different patches of land, and the vegetation here is shaded in different green colors with more intense green, meaning more vegetation, palatable vegetation in fact, and the triangle is the village from which the cattle herd is leaving in the morning following this grazing itinerary during the day. Now, if we assume this kind of ellipsoid shape of the itinerary, the cattle could go anywhere within the red circle. So the red circle is demarcating the potential grazing area, and the itinerary is a GPS-tracked real grazing path. We investigated the biomass on offer along herded cattle herds and along the itinerary of free grazing cattle. And what you can see is that along the itinerary of herded animals, the biomass on offer was much higher than if they had gone on a random walk in that red circle. Whereas for the unattended cattle, the biomass along their pathway was about the same as if they had gone on a random walk. So we see that herding is contributing to well-fed animals and, in consequence, of course, a higher yield of products. Herding can also improve the supply of minerals to animals. And what you see here is the salt cure in northern Niger, where different groups of pastoralists are herding their cattle to mineral-rich soils and thus mineral-rich forage in the end of the rainy season in about August, September. And in these areas, the cattle and also camels and sheep and goats can then replenish their body mineral reserves to endure the coming dry season. Healthier and more productive animals will, of course, yield again more products, and especially also the carbon footprint of these products is lower in comparison to animals that are weak and less productive. Herding also optimizes the utilization of rangelands. Here you see 3 village territories, again in Niger. And in these different territories, you have these polygons that depict landscapes or landscape parts that can be grazed. Above, you see the grazing pressure exerted by herded cattle and sheep and goats. And below, you see the grazing pressure exerted by unattended animals. And you see that the herded animals distribute much more evenly across the landscape, and there is fewer areas of high grazing density or high grazing pressure. And we can thus conclude that herding is more evenly spreading the grazing pressure, thus reducing the risk of overgrazing, of soil degradation, and soil erosion. Herding can also be used on privately owned rangeland, as you can see here in Olmaiso Ranch in northern Kenya, where you see bunch grazing of Boran cattle on the one hand in a drier year, and here in the lower picture in a more moist year. Now, a similar mob grazing, herded mob grazing was used in a ranch in Namibia. And what you can see from the data here is that with this kind of mob grazing with an intermediate stocking density, the biomass yield in most years was higher than the conventional, the biomass yield obtained with conventional grazing, but was also higher than the biomass yield obtained after doubling the conventional stocking rate. Of course, the variation is also influenced by the rainfall, but even in the dry year, the biomass yield of this mob grazing paddocks was higher than of the control. So we can see that with herding, we can judiciously manage the grazing pressure and increase the yield of the pasture and thus again, of course, animal nutrition. Herding can also modulate the nutrient recycling to either cropland or pastures. Here again, you have village territory in Niger where these needles, these black dots, depict the encampment of Fulani pastoralists, and they deliberately corral their cattle overnight on fields that need fertilization. So dung is accumulating on these corral spots, and you see here in the left-hand side the gray phosphorus content of the soil, and in the right-hand side graph you see the total nitrogen content of the upper soil layer. And from this we can conclude that with herding you can judiciously target nutrient deposits across the landscape and thus of course increase crop yield and the nutritional situation of the population, but also again of the animals, because with higher crop yields you normally also have higher yields of crop residues, and these crop residues are fed to the animals in the dry season. Here you see again a corralling, overnight corralling of cattle, this time again on the private ranch in Kenya and on the grassland. And you see here in the front that the grass is greener, not necessarily yielding more biomass, but probably more nutritious biomass. And the question now is, for how long should cattle be corralled on these pasture spots? Of course, as you increase the corralling duration, there is more dung deposited, but at the same time, the area that can be covered with this management tool is shrinking. And for the cropland, at least, we have determined that a manure application rate of about 3 tons of dry matter per hectare is sufficient to yield quite good amounts of pearl millet. But for this pasture area, the research is still ongoing. However, we can conclude that even in grazed areas, the targeted nutrient deposits increase biomass yield biomass quality, and in this case on the ranch, this is used to attract wild herbivores for tourist viewing. The herding also preserves genetic resources of the herded herbivores, but also of companion animals. What you see in the left-hand side picture is a herd of Mbororo cattle in Niger, mixed with some white Fulani, and in the front you have the so-called Bali sheep. On the right-hand side picture, you see a herd of merino sheep, so quite normal sheep, but you see the herding dogs that are of old German shepherd breed, and without utilization by these transhuman herders, these shepherd dogs would disappear quite soon. Herding also preserves cultural landscapes and habitats. And again, you have here on the upper left-hand side a picture from northern Germany, the Lüneburg Heath, a region that is grazed by mobile or transhuman flocks of an old sheep breed, the Heidschnucke, and they keep the landscape with this typical vegetation. Similarly, you have in the lower picture sheep, merino sheep, grazing a calcareous pasture in the southern part of Germany. And only with these sheep grazing here, the invasion of the pasture by the juniperous trees is avoided and a high biodiversity for flora and fauna is maintained. And on the upper right-hand side picture, you see a flock of goats grazing the understory of a Mediterranean forest in the southern part of France. And with that grazing of the goats, the incidence of bushfires is greatly reduced. Herding also contributes to the preservation of cultural heritage. And you see here in this picture a Kazakh herder and eagle master who is training his gold eagle. And to nourish this animal, the herder needs about 6 to 9 lambs per year. And so the UNESCO intangible heritage of falconry goes hand in hand with herding small ruminants. Otherwise, there is a disconnection between this falconry and the sort of land management. But we have a lot of threats to the herders and the herding profession nowadays. And of course, the most obvious and also ubiquitous is the increasing variability of climate, which makes the prediction of the availability of forage in time and space more and more difficult. We have population growth, especially high rates of population growth in Africa, and this leads to the expansion of cropping areas and to land grabbing, which is then challenging the key resources of pastoralists, of mobile pastoralists and of herders, namely their trekking corridors that you can see here in these red lines, and their resting areas and wells, which you can see here with these dots. And in addition to the threat to these key resources, there is, of course, also mobility impeding regulations concerning either animal health or just legal issues such as state boundaries. And what you see on that picture here is a couloir de passage, so a trekking route of cattle in Niger that is increasingly narrowed down and obstructed by the fields on the left and right hand side, because the farmers of course know that this trekking route is very fertile because thousands of cattle and sheep and goats are passing along every year and deposit their nutrients. And so the farmers crop into the trekking route, and at the end, the pastoralists will not be able anymore to go from one pasture to the next, or they will have to intrude the field with the herd, and then we have the infamous herder-farmer conflicts. Other problems are the partial social isolation that herders have to face while they are out with their herds, and in many countries, at least in Africa, often also low societal esteem. The working conditions are quite harsh, and the remuneration, especially for hired herders, is relatively low. And they all face high risks of either predators, such as in East Africa or in the mountainous areas of Asia, or increasingly in Western and Central Africa, the risk of being attacked by armed robbers or even terrorist groups. So we need to support the herders and the herding profession, and key to that, in my view and my colleagues' view, is an official and non-negotiable protection of their key pastoral resources, namely these trekking corridors. And this is not only applying to the herders in Africa, it's also valid for all the few transhuman herders left in Europe. We also need an enhanced state presence in pastoral areas, especially those that are threatened by banditry and terrorism. We need a professional recognition of the herders and, on the other hand, also an implementation of working standards, especially for hired herders, and an adequate remuneration. The herders themselves should care more for professional organization and use lobbying to make their claims on their key resources. The knowledge transfer from one herder generation to the next should be seconded by officially recognized training centers or institutions, such as they are built up in France, and by career perspectives, not only within herding, but also in the livestock value chain. And then, of course, we have from several countries in Asia quite good examples of community-based organization of herding, of grouping the herds and sharing tasks. This is something that, especially in Africa, is not so much developed and might also be something that herders and herding families can organize amongst themselves. And with this, I thank you for your attention.
Thanks for that, Eva. That's really interesting. I'm just going to start off the questions and then I'll let everyone else ask away. So the question I had for you related to the threat of technology. Do you consider, you know, the increasing use of GPS and satellite to not only predict and evaluate sort of pasture or vegetation coverage, but also to track animals and potentially to use them or to move them around? Is that a threat to the herding lifestyle, or do you think it's something that could be taken up as sort of a tool?
Well, I mean, it can only be taken up as a tool by people who have money and who own the land. Yeah. And in many regions in Africa and also in Asia, this is not the case. So if you look to the ranches in Africa, and I'm not so much into the ranching context, it's more the colleague Christian Hülsebusch who is there. Then again, for the ranchers, it's more reliable to employ herders. So these Kenyan ranchers and also the ranchers in Namibia, they employ local herdsmen in order to graze their cattle within the paddock. So they are at that moment not yet employing these modern smart technologies, but rather rely on human capacities.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. So do you think even with sort of government support, or because I imagine that there's sort of like an ecological benefit to this herding and making sure that animals graze the landscape sort of the right way. Do you think government subsidies are going to become something that might encourage people to keep sort of doing these activities, or?
Well, when I talk about Africa, you often see that the rich people, so former government employees, former ministers keep a lot of cattle, large herds, and they entrust them to impoverished Fulani herders who are then just hired herders. But then there is sort of a discrepancy in investing in cattle, in livestock, and not caring for the land because the land is far away. So the rich people who own cattle sit in the capital cities, and the herders are out in the bush somewhere, several hundred kilometers away with the herds. And when they occasionally come back, or when occasionally the owner is visiting the herd, there's just complaining about the bad looks and meager animals, and maybe accusing the herd of having stolen animals. So as long as the policymakers are not accepting that herding, especially in the semi-arid and arid regions, is the best way of exploring the land, or grazing is the best way of exploring the land, as long as always crop production is preferred over livestock production, we will not have a change in also the appreciation of the herding tasks. Okay. And of course, there's little cat. The picture I showed in the last slide, it's an 8-year-old boy I met 2 weeks ago in Ghana. He's never going to school. But also the policymakers don't care. So these people are considered some sort of uncivilized people who run around in the bush, but they are sort of useful because they herd the wealth of rich people.
So the next thing I wanted to ask you about was sort of the scale of these herding systems. Like, obviously, some of the situations you're talking about are very sort of extensive landscapes. But do you think, and sort of like, what sort of scale do you think that this herding can apply to? Can it apply to a smaller scale, or have you sort of looked at that?
Yeah, I mean, the herding normally occurs in a radius of about 50 kilometers around the settlements. But when they go then on transhumance, they can pass 200 kilometers one way. That is, however, a bit extreme. So normally you have something between 100 and 150 kilometers one way, and then coming back to the village after the rainy season. You have rainy season transhumance in the more northern parts or more arid parts, and you sometimes have a dry season migration to the more humid savannas of Africa in the border zone between the semi-arid and the subhumid zone. So you have a lot of migration always going on.
Thank you, Eva, for the presentation. I just have one question. How can we improve the image of herding, and how can we stimulate motivation for new herden manner and people in Africa? Because we know that we need that. So there is a lot of work to do, but the motivation and the wishing is probably a default.
Yeah, I think what it really needs is lobbying in the first place, and informing policymakers, and sort of advertising that herding is not something you can delegate to an 8-year-old boy and his 15-year-old brother. But that it needs real skills, and that these skills are also quite difficult to obtain, so that it is not something that is done by the stupid people in the bush, but by very skilled and knowledgeable people. And on the other hand, of course, the labor standards would need to be raised, and there should be then a security that if I herd for someone else, I have my salary, I have extra payments if the herd is well fed, and so on. But I think working standards in general are still very problematic for many jobs in many countries of Africa. So I'm not sure that we find a solution that really is reducing the problems at a great scale, but we have projects running in different parts of Africa, especially West Africa, where we always try to incorporate the herders and not just focus on the sedentary crop farmers or crop livestock farmers.
So is the uptake, I guess, of the herding profession in decline then, or is it something that, you know, perhaps there's not a lot of choice in some of these societies?
Yeah, of course, there is not always a lot of choice, but if you talk to young people, and yeah, they would like to have livestock, but not herd by themselves. And this is not only something I encounter in Africa, but also I saw it in Near East, Middle East, and in Mongolia. So if you ask the children, but even sometimes if you ask the parents, should the children continue herding? They say, well, they should have a herd, but herding should be done by someone else. They should go to school. And especially in Mongolia, I've seen a lot of parents investing in university education of their children. So these children will not come back to herding.
Yes, Dr. Eva, thank you very much for your question. One thought that I have is the government's putting regulations about herding? Because, for instance, here in the United States, I'm here located in the United States, the government actually puts regulation of what lands can be herded and what lands cannot. So, and also because, you know, they try to protect the native species, the native plants and native animals. Do you see that coming in? I mean, probably I've never been in Africa, so I just wondering, what is the situation in Africa and if there is any conflicts with, you know, the wild animals and the domestic species and how the governments or how the producers are approaching this issue. Thank you very much for your presentation.
Well, thank you for the question. I mean, in West Africa, you have often you have a few parks, national parks or transboundary parks where grazing is not allowed. And you have so-called forest reserves where grazing is restricted. And it always depends on how strongly this is controlled. So in fact, there are laws that are providing or not prohibiting grazing, but also there are laws that should foster grazing. So initially, the zone north of the 15th degree latitude was designed completely pastoral area in countries like Niger and Mali and Burkina Faso. But with population growth, people started to cultivate these areas, and there was never a no to the crop cultivators, but always a no to the pastoralists. Yeah, so cropping is seen to put land in value, whereas grazing is not seen as putting land in value. And also the ownership of land is with the crop growers or with the sedentary people, and the mobile people only have user rights, which makes the whole thing even more difficult, of course.